I am Howard Sterling, and a disclaimer. I'm not a Jewish scholar, and I am a Jew who wants to understand Judaism's key concepts at a deep level. Second, this talk is inspired by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, AHAVA Shalom, specifically his podcast called Is Our Most Famous Prayer a Prayer? In the podcast, Rabbi Sachs argues cogently and persuasively that the Jewish central prayer, the Shma, is really learning, meaning that God is speaking to us rather than a prayer where we speak to God. I would like humbly to build on Rabbi Sachs's important conclusion with small questions and potential answers of my own as to the Shema. Specifically, I focus as to paradoxes in the Shema as I see them. Let's focus first on the key initial phrases of the Shema. Shma Yisrael, Hashem EILOKENU, Hashem ECHAD. I begin with what to me are changes from the usual translation. The initial translation of the initial phrase, Shma Yisrael, is usually translated, Hear, O Israel. I suggest that the first word, Shema, should be strengthened in translation, so that the word Shema should be translated not as hear, but as listen, perceive, or even know. K-N-O-W. If the Shema is so central to Jewish learning, as Rabbi Sachs states, and I agree, Hashem wants us to know, not just to hear. The second word is Yisrael, usually translated simply as Israel. But what is Israel? I suggest that the Yisrael in the Shma Yisrael has at least three connotations or translations. One is Am Yisrael, the entire people of Israel, encompassing all Jews. The second is the person who was first called Yisrael in the Bible, Yaakov Avinu. The third connotation, which is perhaps the most important, is Yisrael means each Jew individually, you and me. Next, I asked, why is the phrase Shma Yisrael then followed by Hashem EILOKENU, Hashem ECHAD? Clearly, these must be very important phrases. Usually, they're translated as the Lord is our God, the Lord is one in English. I will make suggestions which again differ from the standard translations and are not, to my knowledge, found in Chazal, the rabbinic translations. In fact, forgive me, my suggestions are only from my limited insight. I start with the paradox that in Jewish thought, Hashem and Elokeinu in the second phrase are usually thought as opposite facets, opposite concepts about the deity. That is to say, Hashem is usually thought of as the compassionate, forgiving nature of the deity, according to Jewish tradition, whereas Elokeinu, plural possessive of Elohim or Elokim, is the deity's strict justice, legal facet. To set a framework to answer, to resolve the paradox of the second phrase of the Shema, I must say I was very influenced by a book I read in the 70s by an Italian psychoanalyst. I think it's called The Power of the Will. Unfortunately, I forgot the name of the author. The author said that when we are faced with a true paradox, as in the second phrase of the Shema, we draw a diagram. First, a straight line between the two elements of the paradox. Here, Hashem at one end and Elokeinu at the other end. The author says importantly that one does not solve any paradox by moving 50% along the line between one side or the other, or 66% between one side or the other. In other words, another way of saying that is, in paradoxes, we do not make compromises. Rather, in other words, as to the second phrase of the Shema, it does not make sense to say Hashem Elokeinu means 50% of Hashem and 50% of Elokeinu, for example. The answer to the paradox, according to the author, must lie above the line, halfway between, but above, not on the line, but forming an equilateral triangle. I will show that three instantiations of using this triangle for solving the paradox of the second phrase of the Shema is the correct one for solving the paradox of Hashem Elokeinu. The first is my attempt with a smile, even a laugh, to solve the paradox by making an analogy from the second phrase to, of all things, quantum mechanics as applied to the scientific paradox of light. Specifically and scientifically, physicists can prove that at the same time, light is a wave, like an ocean wave. And paradoxically, light is a particle, a static object. Yet light, obviously, and physically, is one unitary thing we call light. Analogously, Hashem in Hashem Elokeinu is the opposite of Elokeinu, yet light, we are told in the third phrase of the Shema, that Hashem is ECHAD, radically one unique singularity, like light. My second resolution is based on the framework of Jewish learning versus Jewish practice or law. That is to say, the basic and biggest source of Jewish learning, the exposition of Jewish law, is the Talmud or Gemara. In the thousands of pages of the Talmud, the basic format is rabbis arguing with each other on what constitutes Jewish law. The rabbis usually taking opposite, diametrically opposed stances. It is said that in the Talmud, there is only one agreed conclusion among the thousands of oppositely inclined rabbinic arguments. So how do we get a unity out of opposite rabbinic stances? Luckily, we have two Jewish geniuses. In the premier Jewish codes of Moshe Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah, and of Joseph Caro, the Shulchan Aruch, each aspect of Jewish law, so argumentative in the Talmud, comes to one conclusion about each law. Like Hashem Echad, out of the opposites of Hashem Elokeinu. The third analogy I want to draw for the second and perhaps third phrases of the Shema is oddly to the ideal democratic process. In democracy, usually on every important issue, there are two strong opposite sides. Yet we pass laws analogous to the legal codes of Maimonides and Caro that are unity one. Finally, what is the meta summary from the seeming paradox of the middle and third phrase of the first sentence of the Shema, which is the most important Jewish learning or prayer? Ultimately, these paradoxes are to teach us two lessons. First, that on every important question, there are two strong, usually opposite sides. We, on one side or the other, should listen to and understand respectfully the other side, as did the Jewish sage Hillel. Second, even though it's difficult, we must delve. We must beat our brains out to get the overriding unity of one truth.